Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Cox. I'm the Royal Society Professor for Public Engagement in Science, and this is a new interactive show from the BBC where together we explore how science and technology are changing the world and shaping our future. This is Tomorrow's World Live. Thank you. Tonight we're at the Science Museum in London in a gallery dedicated to more than 200 years of innovation in information and communication. An ideal setting for tonight's conversation on the future of artificial intelligence with Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google for 10 years. Now, Eric helped grow the company from a very small tech startup to the publicly funded and publicly traded giant it is today. Until recently, he was executive chairman of Google's parent company, Alphabet Inc., and he's now moving to a new role as a technical advisor. Now, some of our live audience here will be putting questions to Eric directly later in the show. And I should say that both the Science Museum and the Royal Society have received funding from Google. Now, let's meet our guests. Please give a warm welcome to Eric Schmidt.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Eric, thanks for joining us. I suppose the first question has to be a definition. So how would you define AI?
You know, artificial intelligence, the term was invented in the late 1950s by some scientists who thought about it, and they thought that we should have a term for when computers do things that look like human work, human intelligence. So think of it as the computer seems human-like in its judgment or its ability.
And we hear many terms attached to AI. So you hear machine learning, in the context of Google in particular, deep learning. So could you just comment on the difference? What do those terms mean?
So machine learning generally means that a computer has been trained against a large set of data. And the kind of deep learning that is now in vogue is a mathematical construct where we take essentially neural nets, which are essentially probability matrices of outcomes, and we use them to classify things. Typical example would be you'll use a deep network to look at a picture. And the first network, the first layer, will say, hey, it's a picture, it's got corners. The second layer will say, there's boundaries within the corners. The third layer will say, hey, there's shapes inside of this. And eventually the top layer will say, it's a Madonna and a child, you know, with a television set or something like that. And their number of layers is typically 10 to 12. Our field exploded with the invention of these deep neural networks because it allowed us to do vision.
So in terms of, you used a technical term there about the matrix of probabilities. So just a bit more specifically, because a neural net, it sounds like a brain, doesn't it?
In fact, the idea is very much paralleled by the way our brains work. So your brain, all of us, have brains which are remarkably parallel. And what they do is they use synapses and they fire along complicated pathways in parallel. And a neural network uses mathematical weights in a matrix or a tensor. And as it adjusts those weights, it learns things. And it learns them in relatively simple ways. But if you do it at scale, it learns remarkably well. If you show in Google Images enough pictures where you say there's a giraffe in this, the deep neural network will, then when you give it another picture, will say, hey, there's a giraffe in this picture. And that's how, for example, simple image search and simple language recognition works.
So we don't necessarily know how the machine is making the decisions or making the selection, but we've trained it to make the selection.
And one of the concerning things about this technology is that the underlying mathematics is not fully understood. So one of the concerns that people have is, where should you use it? Well, you shouldn't use these things in, for example, a life-critical decision unless you know exactly all of its failure modes. But because it's trained and it's trained in this complicated way, we may not know all of its failure modes at the moment, although people are working very hard to discover these things.
So by failure modes, in a sense you mean that we don't know what decision this system will make in a particular case, even though we'd like to know, we'd like it to be predictable.
My favorite example here is I'm driving the car, I don't know about in Britain, but in California there's something called the California rolling stop, where you don't really quite stop for the stop sign. So the policeman comes over in my self-driving car and says to me, you rolled through the stop sign. And I say, officer, I was not driving. And the car, which is listening, says, yes, officer, I was driving. And the officer says to the car, why did you run the stop sign? And the car says, I don't know. And that's a truthful statement. We've got to get to that next level of understanding.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the future applications and some of the moral questions actually raised by self-driving cars in a moment. But could you give some context to people about what AI systems or deep learning systems they're using now? Because the cars are about to appear.
Well, you all use this every day when you use Google products, and indeed many of the other tech companies are using them as well. If you use Google Translate, you're using these systems. Again, it was trained from a large corpus of data. It doesn't have a dictionary. It learned it from its experience in this training mechanism. Any kind of vision classification, vision was the first one that really came out. Most people think that at this point, computer vision is better than human vision, right? So that's important because things which are vision sensitive might be augmented better if a computer is helping you see.
So when many of us, I suppose, use Google Translate, but that was not, it's intriguing you say there's no dictionary there. It learns how to translate.
It's actually bizarre. How could you do Google Translate 100 by 100 languages? Well, we now have the ability to do real-time translation, literally out of the movies. You speak into the phone, and out comes out in the other language. And it does this by taking your voice, digitizing it, sending it to the translator, sending it into a different language, and then translating it back into speech. This works real time. That changes everything in a world of multiple languages.
And it's true to say that we, Google, the engineers, don't really know precisely what's going on in that computation every time you use Google Translate.
We understand how it works in our system. But if you said, I'm now going to rely to it on being perfect, we can't prove that it has no errors in it. And that's why it's important to understand where the limits of this technology are today.
Yeah, in terms of Alphabet, actually, so what we've heard of Google Translate, the search algorithm itself, the Google search algorithm is an expert system, isn't it? It's machine
That's correct. And the general term for these things is expert systems. We now use them, for example, for recommendations on YouTube. It turns out that as much as you think of yourself as an individual, people who are looking at similar videos often choose the next ones. And so we can make much smarter recommendations. We can do the same thing about recommending which applications to purchase for Android phones. So the notion of using these things for vision, recommendation systems, and things which are advisory is a very powerful one. And I think this is why the digital industry has gone crazy over this stuff, because we have very large amounts of training data. And these algorithms get better when you have more and more data. So an example would be, you'd say, well, okay, you're so good at predicting giraffes in photographs, why can't you predict horrific terrorism? And the good news is it's an extremely rare event. There's not enough training data for us to do it. But things which are extremely common, like how your health works, how people behave in crowds, those kinds of things, we can do a much better job of predicting.
Now, I just wanted to go back in time a little bit. We have a photograph of this qubit computer, the next computer, which you can see on the screen there, I think. That doesn't look like much, but there it is, was the first computer that ran the World Wide Web. This is Tim Berners-Lee's first web server. And actually, you see that sort of scruffy little sticker on the front of it? That was an instruction not to turn it off. Because at the time, and we're talking about the late 1980s, early 90s, if you turn that off, you turn the whole web off. You move forward 10 years from that, the web on one little computer, and we have Google.
And by the way, there was a Google server at Stanford.
Yeah.
That was in Larry and Sergey's dorm room, that if you turned it off, the entire web search would go down.
All of Google.
Right.
Yeah, so you
and they have a famous story where they actually ran out of power in their room, so they had to run they managed to run power to the next guy's dorm room, right, to power their server in their room. Now, why you'd want to have a Google server in your bedroom is a separate discussion.
When was that? Do you remember what year that was?
This would have been 1996, 1997, so 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's really the heart of my question. It's not, and you joined not long after, was it 2001?
Yeah, the web was 1991, so Tim's work, which is extraordinary, created the network. And I remember when I first talked to Tim about it and I first saw the Mosaic browser, and I thought, this is powerful because we would be able to see the information. But nobody understood the power of that as a platform. So in the industry that I'm now have been in for my whole life, the way you really win is when you build platforms that people can extend of information. And the web has become that. And I think we'll see these development of these platforms in other areas, in healthcare and things which we all care a lot about.
Did it take you by surprise from 2001 to where we are now? I mean, it's, what, 15 years?
I went back to my college and I estimated that the college computer, of which you have an example here, is 100 million times less powerful than my Android phone, or your iPhone, I might add. So how do you understand 100 million times improvement? Well, you can see it here in the museum. If you look at the induction coils and the other things around us, think how immense they are. Most of these things are now replaced by essentially software using very subtle digital things that have occurred over 30 years. One of the interesting problems, by the way, is that Moore's law, which is the doubling of computer density every 18 to 24 months, is slowing down. And so there's a great question in our industry as to how many more of these miracles will be possible before we hit real limits of physics. You're a physicist. This is something you would know a lot about.
Yeah, and I suppose we rely on some new innovation, quantum computing or something like that, don't we?
And there are many people who believe in this year that something called quantum supremacy will be demonstrated. Quantum entanglement, which is where two apparently non-connected quanta actually appear to communicate, has been demonstrated. And again, from physics, this is all true. Many people believe in the next year we'll be able to build computer systems that are capable of showing quantum supremacy and operate in the way the digital world, the analog world really works. So the hope in science, which is interesting, is that in your field, you're simulating or digitizing an analog or real world system that's driven by quantum computing. Well, now we'll have a real quantum computing. We can see how it actually works.
Yeah. We're going to go to one of our audience questions, actually, which is from Lizzie Meta. So if Lizzie's there.
Stand up. Hi. I just wanted to ask, do you think that AI could ever be used in a classroom environment in a school?
Well, I think AI should be used all the time, and especially in classrooms, and I'll tell you why. All of us have grown up in classrooms where we were treated the same as the other students. But we know from learning science that we all learn very differently. Wouldn't it be better if the computer could talk to you a little bit, maybe verbally, and you could explain the way you like to learn, the things you're interested in, and that it could design a lesson plan that was completely tailored not to what you want, but to the best way you learn? Now, why would that be AI? Because there are enough people who are like you who learn the same way that if we just had enough of you, we would eventually figure out that you're in category A, B, and C, and we could offer that. Most people believe that the classroom in the future will be much, much more individual using these techniques. One simple example is, you remember all those pesky math problems that were so difficult? Well, we now have evidence that we can select the smallest number of pesky math problems for you to learn a particular concept, and that differs by person.
That'd be useful. My 8-year-old could do with that, actually.
Think about all those math problems that you didn't have to do.
Yeah. Now, if you just started watching, I'm Brian Cox, and we are talking to Eric Schmidt as part of the BBC's Tomorrow's World Live about artificial intelligence. I wanted to move on to the second part of tonight's discussion, which is something that concerns a lot of people. You've touched on it already, actually, which is the ethics of AI, but also the social impact. One of the things we hear a lot about in the press at the moment is the destruction of jobs, traditional jobs, by, if we said, expert systems. You can see self-driving cars are going to destroy the jobs of taxi drivers, for example. Call centres already quite automated. So how do you, or how do Alphabet as a company, or you in the industry, think of that impact of this technology?
There's a lot of evidence that we're not changing jobs, but we are changing tasks. And again, if you walk around this extraordinary museum and you look at the steam age things on the bottom floor, imagine the number of jobs that used to exist that were horrific in their working environment that are today automated. This has been true since the invention of the loom here roughly 150 years ago in this country. So the fact of the matter is there's always been some task automation and new tasks come along. Most people that I've talked to who have looked at the economics of this think that it doesn't reduce the job, but it changes the job. And there's lots of evidence that people who work with computers make more money than people who don't. So there will be some jobs eliminated, but the vast majority will be augmented. You're going to have more doctors, not fewer, more lawyers, not fewer, more teachers, not fewer, but they're going to be more efficient. And if the system is more efficient, then presumably we can deal with the challenges that everybody is complaining about, the real challenges of people's lives.
It's quite an ask, though. There was a Bank of England report recently that quoted a number, 150 million jobs in Britain. 15 million, maybe 150 million would be a problem, but 15 million is quite a problem because that's still approaching 50% of the number of jobs in the economy might be vulnerable to this sort of
But the problem with those analyses, which are printed in the headlines, is they don't account for the fact that jobs change, that people change, that the economics and capitalism work, and that people end up in jobs which are probably higher paying. Classic example is people will say, well, we won't have truck drivers. So ignoring the fact that whether you want to have trucks driving with no human inside the cab, what does a truck driver do? They do a lot, right? They're responsible for the security of the truck. They do the loading of the truck. They're responsible for its delivery. They give its location. There are all sorts of tasks that are unlikely to be automated. And there are many tasks. It was interesting that we talked earlier about what would people like to automate the most in their lives? And most of the surveys indicate that the number one thing is a robot to clean up the kitchen and put all the dishes away, okay? Right, that certainly makes sense to me. That turns out to be an incredibly hard problem, right? Years, decades before we'll be able to have your robot.
I was at a conference recently, actually, an EU conference, discussing innovation policy. And there was a statement made I thought was interesting, which is the job of the innovation system is to create more jobs than it destroys. And so government spends a lot of time thinking about the way we can invest in universities, etc., to reinforce that innovation system. So do companies such as Alphabet engage in that kind of space? Do you think, I suppose as responsible corporate citizens, about making sure the innovation system creates new jobs faster than it destroys?
We do very much. In our case, we have a venture arm which has more than 100 million pounds investing in the miracle that's going on here in Britain over entrepreneurship. There are more entrepreneurial companies of the kind that I care about here than in the sum of the continent. And they're located in London and in Cambridge and in Manchester and a number of other smaller areas. You've got all the necessary components. You've got the educational system, you've got the talent. We bought a company here called DeepMind, which if there is a company that will invent general intelligence, it's likely to be done here at King's Cross by this Cambridge-inspired startup. We know the value of these people.
Many of us are aware actually about, we talked about the fear of destroying jobs. The other fear is the way that information in general or online is used. And there's been a lot of press recently about, for example, the interference in elections in both the US and the UK. So how much responsibility do you feel for your expert systems enabling that sort of manipulation, or hopefully making it rather more difficult?
I think that all the tech companies have some responsibilities. I'll give you an example. YouTube is an incredibly powerful platform, and it would make recommendations. And because the algorithm was so good, if there were a recommendation of a sort of a video that was likely to be alarming, it would keep giving more alarmist video recommendations. And we categorize the videos. These are legal, but they're kind of alarmist. So if you were just to watch the YouTube television in front of you, you'd say, oh my God, the world is about to end, right, because of all this alarmist stuff. We changed that algorithm. So that's an example of the kind of responsibility. I think in the social networks, they're working hard on this. They have a responsibility to police essentially the automated sharing of bad information, which is relatively easy because these are sharing sensitive platforms. By the way, all of these problems are easily detected by computers if we just focus on it. We can detect these kinds of attacks.
How do you feel you should engage with the wider society? So let's say the political process, which I suppose the interface between people and an industry in some sense, in order to build, I suppose what you're talking about really is building policy here. In this case, policy in terms of news management, or what is fake news, or how should we balance the output of a search engine, for example. So is that something that concerns you, that interface with, I suppose, public requirements?
20 years ago, the tech industry in America would give you an answer which was, what we're doing is below the radar, it's really interesting, leave us alone. That is not the view of the industry, and certainly not the view of Google and Alphabet. And we spent a great deal of time with policymakers talking about the technology. And here in Britain, for example, both under David Cameron's administration, now Mrs. May administration, we had very lengthy conversations with all of the regulators. And they're struggling too. They're trying to deal with the misuse of technology in encryption and terrorism. They're trying to deal with public safety, essentially, which is very important. They're trying to deal with this question of fake news, as it's generally called, and the manipulation of it. My tagline is, I'm very strongly in favor of free speech for humans, but not robots, right? Now, it turns out to be hard to write that rule, right? So they're struggling to write down an implementable rule.
Yeah, I suppose it's, when we're talking really about when expert systems, let's call them that, are making decisions, and we've talked about information flow and how you regulate it. I suppose another area that concerns people is when they're making life and death decisions, for example, in the control of a car, or an aircraft, or whatever it may be, a medical expert system perhaps. So how do you begin to face those dilemmas? I mean, the great dilemmas, the classic one I suppose with a car is if you have to have an accident because it's inevitable, the laws of physics tell you you're going to crash, who do you damage, who do you injure, who potentially do you kill? How do you make those decisions?
And part of my answer to that, by the way, I think these questions are going to be regulated. I don't think they're going to be left to the vendors and the industry, and I think they properly should be. They're important decisions, and the automobile industry is regulated. The car industry can't just randomly do what it would like. I would start, when we talk about that, by saying, what would you do in that situation? So a starting point is what does a human do? And do we think that's a reasonable response? And the correct answer is to avoid getting yourself into that situation in the first place. In America, the number of deaths on highways is about 33,000. The number here in Britain is some number of thousands, 4,000 or 5,000. Most of those seem to be young people at the prime of their lives. Anything we can do to make cars safer through this automation, we should do, and we should do now. And if you've ever met with anybody or you've had a family tragedy like that, we have a moral responsibility to do it as fast as we can.
Yeah, I suppose you're asking one of the great unsolved philosophical questions in a sense, or you're asking the car to make that choice. For example, how do you value different human lives? The lives of the passenger, the client, I suppose, in a sense, the person that owns the car, and the lives of somebody outside.
So again, I think the goal with cars is to make them as safe as commercial airplane flight. If you look at commercial airplane flights, there are so few accidents that every accident is individually studied and small modifications to the regulations and the systems. I think we can get there with personal transportation. I really do. So think of it in a model where we're having this debate because there was one car crash in Britain last year, and we're having a violent debate over this issue, right? I want to be at that point because we will have saved so many thousands of lives.
There's one, Elon Musk often says he's concerned about expert systems, artificial intelligence. I suppose one example that occurs to me is already in financial transactions, for example, we use expert systems to make split-second decisions. You can make more profit that way. But I suppose if you imagine those decisions moved into something, for example, the response to a missile strike, if you think that your country can have an advantage by being swift in its military decision-making, clearly there you're handing over to a system that you don't quite understand, as you said before, actually, you don't quite understand why. But also, you would expect a human to have something, it's intangible, I suppose, human morality.
So we have a culture where we trust humans over the equivalent computer decision, and which is fine. So in all the scenarios that I can think of that are like that, you want a human in the loop. You want the computer to assist the man or woman to make the best decision possible in a split second. If you put any kind of automatic triggering, I would refer you to Dr. Strangelove and the danger of a doomsday machine. So if you take these things to their logical conclusion, you end up in a very bad singularity in a physics sense. So it's very, very important that both from a policy and regulatory perspective, that life-critical decisions are made by humans who bear the human responsibility from that.
So you don't think that at the moment, anyway, the idea of trying to encode human ethics into a system is going to be necessary, really? Because when an ethical decision needs to be made, you would envisage it being handed over.
There's a large group of people who are working on fairness and ethics and decision for precisely this reason. The issue that they face is that there is not agreement, even among this room, as to some of the ethical choices that you can posit. We can come up with difficult decisions where half the group would make one decision, half would make the other. Same for our viewers online. So until we can answer it precisely, right, what are you trying to optimize? I think it's better to have a human in the loop. These systems work by what are called objective functions, and you program them, what is its goal, right? But if you can't give it a clear goal, you're better off having a human involved.
We're going to go to an audience question now from Mary Parry. So is Mary here?
Hi, good evening. My question is whether AI represents the next industrial revolution.
The way I'd like to say it is I think we're moving from the industrial age to the information age to the age of intelligence. And that the way humans in 50 years and 100 years will be successful is that they're just going to be much, much smarter than we can imagine them, right? That our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren will have these tools which will make them quicker, better judgments, better science. And the example I would use, and we'll use physics, my physics friend, I was talking to my physics friend, and I said...
You got one.
And my most recent physics friend, and I said, what do you need from AI machine learning? And he said, I'll tell you my problem is there's so much physics now, and this is a brilliant person, I can't read it all. I can't understand it all. I said, you can't understand it all? And he goes, I confess. There's so many papers, there's so much activity. So a simple tool that here you are, you're teaching in university, you have an insight, you go home at dinner, you send a note to the computer saying, I want you to think about this supposition that I have. It reads every paper, right, and comes back with correlations and ideas that suggest something for you. Think of it as a savant, right? It's an idiot savant that's particularly good at physics, right? And we have a small but very important customer base, you, right, and your colleagues. The most interesting areas are in areas like chemistry, where the problems are relatively clear. The objective function, that is what you're trying to measure, is relatively clear. It's not like biology, which is just extraordinarily complicated. We think that we can, for example, advance the creation of new materials, new chemistries, many, many new things. If you care about pollution, which we care a lot about, right, we can make things which don't pollute. Energy efficiency, healthcare, et cetera.
Well, if you've just tuned in, you are watching Tomorrow's World live from the Science Museum. I'm Brian Cox, talking to Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google and Alphabet now. I should say, actually, if you're wondering, we're sat next to, I think you mentioned it earlier, these great coils that are in here. This thing is part of the most powerful radio transmitter in the world in the 1940s. And you see,
today this would be a chip with a software-defined radio,
yes.
This tiny.
It's made of wood now, isn't it? But this over here, you might be wondering what this is, because this tricycle here, believe it or not, is one of the key parts in the setup of Google Maps. So Google Maps a few years ago was not using high-tech cars or cameras, but was using it wasn't you presumably, but riding around on a tricycle. So again, it's
also
moved
have
forward.
A backpack. So the people who hike into the mountains will put this backpack with this strange looking thing on, and they map the hikes up to the top of the mountain.
Yeah, it's moved on, hasn't it? It's technology is leaping forward quickly. We've talked about how AI is changing society, and we've talked about some of the ethics or the ethical dilemmas that might be posed. In the final part tonight, we're going to look to the future. And in a sense, actually, you prefigured it in the answer to the last question. You talked about the idiot savant type of AI, something that can help with a specific task. I suppose often when people talk about artificial intelligence, you're talking about a general intelligence. That's what people are imagining, something that is equivalent to or better than a human, a generalist. We're not there yet. Are we in any way close to that?
Well, it depends on who you ask in the industry. The vast majority of things that you read and talk about and all the investment in our industry is around relatively special purpose AI, the vision algorithms, the driving and things which we're quite sure will work, will get better, and they get better over time. We'll see tremendous gains there. There are people who believe that the developments of artificial intelligence will lead to a kind of general intelligence, which is known as AGI. And it goes something like this. Our DeepMind group built over a time a piece of software called AlphaZero. And in 7 days, it can go from knowing nothing about the game of Go to beating the top Go player in the world, who's brilliant.
A video clip of
we
that,
do?
which whilst you talk about that, it's worth we'll show it. And it's worth watching, actually, while Eric describes it. You see the moment when there's a particular move that the system makes, which probably the best Go player in the world, who's spent his life doing this, and is it on 9th Dan, I think he's got, looks absolutely shocked at the moment. And it'll be played now. So yeah, if you could describe this system.
I'm behind the camera in this room. This is Lee Sedol. Lee Sedol is the top Korean player in the world. There's a contest between the top Chinese player and the top Korean player. Because it's a 19 by 19 game, the number of moves is impossible to calculate and was thought to be incomputable. This move was a move that the computer made that had never been done in a game. And he is so confused because it makes no sense to him. And he's quite convinced that we have screwed up and we are now going to lose. And of course, later, he announced that the invention of this move was the biggest drama of his entire life. He's a professional Go player. And the way this particular move was invented was the computer found a different way to play the game than 2,500 years of humans playing this, largely in Asia. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who play it every day. It turns out we've now repeated the same success with chess, which we can do in 3.5 to 4 days. By the way, this is done by one computer whose rack is about this big. So it's not the huge supercomputers of Google. So the question is, how far does this go? These games have clear objective functions. They don't have any variation. The goal is very clear. Will we be able to adapt these algorithms to deal with emergent behavior, new systems? If I say hello to you and then I say hello to her, I then change the outcome of the next few minutes of my life. How do we anticipate that? All those kinds of questions. Most people believe that we'll begin to see some of this kind of behavior within a decade. nobody knows when we'll be able to get to the point of what I would call a conversational general intelligence.
Yes, that would be something that passes the Turing test.
It's interesting that the Turing test, and Alan Turing is featured here prominently because he's such a brilliant man, was that a person, that basically judges would not be able to tell the difference between a computer and a person behind a screen. And this was posited in the 1950s. The joke is that a Ukrainian boy was used, a 13-year-old boy and a computer, and they couldn't tell the difference between a 13-year-old boy and a computer. And all the parents said, well, boys don't say anything anyway, right? So we've not repeated this test against, women who are highly verbal and adult and so forth and so on. So that was sort of the joke. But we're getting closer to being able to solve the Turing test.
When we talked about the AlphaGo, and again, as you've emphasized all the way through this, these are systems that learn and find their own strategies. In this case, to address a very particular problem, which is win the game of Go. So that behavior, that move, was what you would call emergent. Right? It wasn't programmed in. In fact, I think it's quite remarkable, actually, as you say.
It's a genius move. It just came out. Yeah. But it was in a very, very constrained landscape of choices, which is in a game. The question is, can we do that genius in an unconstrained world?
Yes.
And we don't know. If you go back to my physicist example, it would start by being able to read all the papers. So that's pretty amazing, because there's so many more papers than even the most brilliant physicists can read. What is the point at which the physics would be able to construct some new physics? And that we don't know. My own opinion, which is just my speculation, is we probably need some additional discoveries. In the industry today, the way this is expressed is that the neural nets that we use have got to become automatically generated. In other words, the computer has to generate the networks that make the decision, because it's too hard for humans to make those networks. That's called AutoML. The computers will need to be at least 100 times, maybe 1,000 times more powerful. We can see our way to another factor of 10. Can we see ourselves to another 100 or 1,000? We don't know. And then finally, we have to have a knowledge database. I'll give you another example using cars. This gentleman has a car, and he spends all day training his car to turn left. This gentleman has a car, and he trains all of his car, spends all his day turning his car turning right. He's very good at turning left. He's very good at right. Now, how useful is that? Well, at the end of the day, the two cars exchange information. Now the cars can go left or right. Humans can't do that. So it's possible that we'll be able to build, and this is speculation, these networks of information, and that people will be able to contribute. If that happens, that's a knowledge platform that could augur in a whole new information age.
And then we reminisced about those far-off days of the 1990s when the whole web was on one computer on somebody's desk. And the progress has been immense. Perhaps couldn't have imagined that we get to where we have now. So when do you think this future, which is so really a general AI, something that passes the Turing test, a thing that for all intents and purposes is a thinking, I don't know what the word is, being, I suppose, in itself. Could you guess when that's going to be? And will you project too far into the future, do you think? Could it be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
So in the 90s, there were people who understood that phones would come and the web would come. But they missed the social networks. They missed the Uber and Lyft concepts and so forth. So I think our ability to see even 20 years in advance is limited by our ability to imagine the use of these new platforms. I can see that there will be a knowledge platform of enormous value for research, for making humanity a better place. But my limitation is I don't see what it will be used for, right? That's, to me, the most interesting question. And I'm pretty sure that it'll still be hard to get a robot to put the dishes away in the kitchen, because it's such a hard problem.
Yes. I think we've got a lot of questions, actually, on this section on the future. So I thought I'd go to the audience. First, Toby Sanderson.
Hiya. My question is, do you think that AI has always been an inevitable step in our evolution?
Well, it's interesting that many, many people thought that in the 1970s. And they were doing artificial intelligence using language models. And I studied them when I was a graduate student. And then there was a period of time called the AI winter, as it's known, for about 30 years, where almost everyone abandoned the field. So I don't think it was predetermined. But the original visionaries said that eventually there's got to be a way. But for example, the development of these deep neural nets, which really changed our industry and has driven everyone, crazy, is largely completely unexpected. And it was invented by a team in Canada who were playing around with different kinds of mathematics, and then they discovered a form of gradient mathematics that would allow this transformation at the deep neural network. They tried it on an image set, and they tried it on language, and oh my God. I think we need a few more of those.
And we have a question from Alessandra Nero Quesada.
Good evening. My question is actually based on a book that I'm reading, Homo Deus, and it is, will AI look upon humans the same way that we look upon animals?
So there is a form of science fiction where we spend a lot of time thinking about what happens when there's superintelligence. And so the argument goes something like this, that eventually computers will be capable of not only the kind of deep analysis that I'm describing, but also intent and creativity, and then they'll try to optimize things. And inevitably, when you watch that movie, the first thing they optimize is to put us in a lesser position, and then a human battles the computer. So that script will get you a good movie deal. I think it's unlikely that it'll play out that way for all sorts of reasons. Usually these things are not predicted correctly. I'm pretty sure that the age of intelligence that we're talking about, humans and computers will work very well side to side. That if you will, this volition, this computer, will be smart enough to understand that what we do better than it, we need them, if you will, and it needs us. And that's decades away.
I think it's interesting, actually. You could almost call that the Terminator question, couldn't you, in a sense? Because that's what people tend to think about, don't they?
Watching movies again.
Well, yeah. but I suppose, one thing that struck me about the way you described the possibilities, really, I think what you're talking about is how did we humans, build systems that make the world a better place. That's your view. So you said really that we need to, what you can't see is the reason why we'd build a general artificial intelligence at the moment. Until we have a reason, until we have a use for it that will make our lives better, then we wouldn't aim to do it.
But I think there's general agreement, and I can certainly describe our principles, that these technologies need to be designed and deployed for the benefit of the many, not the few, that is not the elites. They need to be invented in sunlight, that is not in secret military labs like the hydrogen bomb. And they need to be accountable for what they do, right? In the sense that if it claims to be a something, it needs to be not just be truly, but it also needs to be auditable. And I think those principles are pretty good principles to answer your question. So if we follow those principles, which I hope we all will as a society, we won't have the negative scenario of having a super smart intelligence that views us as inferior.
We have a question from Celine Boldier.
Good evening. Thank you. So my question is also in that same vein of the ethics and also the liability. If we ever manage to get to a point where machines are also maybe able to express emotions, for instance, does that mean that we might have to grant them some sort of human-ish rights?
A lot of people believe that computers will be much more tolerable, if you will, if they are much more human-like. And there's quite a bit of work on computers learning human emotion and then replicating it. But it's a tool. So you could have your angry computer that looks like an angry person and your sweet, saint-like person who's so forth. Those are choices that we make. It's very important to remember that we get the choice of what kind of outcome we want. If we train the computer to be prejudiced, it will be prejudiced, right? Please don't do that, right? Let's establish some basic rules. There are quite a few research projects in Britain and in the United States which are attempting to codify the rules of essentially equality and equal opportunity, right? And establishing those as, if you will, the constitution at the base of the computer. Before it starts thinking, it has to think with these values. So a value-centric programming model which would include this emotional question, is, I think, the most likely outcome.
This is almost the Asimov approach, isn't it, to the rules that robots have to follow. But you see, I think you've already said really, but you see that, do you see that construction of the basic ethics of intelligence or intelligence systems to be a society-wide discussion, or do you think it will be made essentially in the industry because the industry are focused on that at the moment? Do you think governments are interested even in feeding into those discussions?
I think if you look at what happened with election meddling and so forth, the industry had its own conception of what could happen, and then governments are responding and saying, fix it or you'll be regulated. And I think that model is a likely model for all of these categories. So at least in innovation, smart people get in the room, they figure this stuff out. It does have biases. The biases may or may not need to be regulated. We've often said that the technology is relatively neutral, right? That it can be programmed. And I think there will be constraints. Hopefully these kinds of constraints will be outcome-based. In other words, they're values-based as opposed to much more prescriptive.
And we have one last question, just time for one more, from Seamus Ray.
Yes, hello. Putin said last year that whoever wins this race, or in fact leads in AI, will rule the world. And then we also had China saying that by 2024 they want to lead this race. Just wanted your views on that.
Thank you for bringing this up. I'm very concerned about this. I think that both the Russian and the Chinese leaders have recognized the value of this, not just for their commercial aspirations, but also their military aspirations. It's very, very important that the incredible engines that exist in Europe and Britain, whatever, United States, et cetera, get more funding for basic research, work on ethics, and so forth. I'd like us to deal with the Chinese and Russian competition, not by copying their approaches, but being more like us, more of the incredible intellects that have been produced here in this country. Now think about the tradition of science represented by the Science Museum here and the history. I literally am incredibly in debt to the last 150 years, as you all are, of the British scientists. Let's have more of them. Let's celebrate them. Let's get as many people to come here from other countries to do the same thing. Let's outrun them with our own intelligence rather than any other outcome.
So I endorse that fully. Well, look, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Almost. So I wanted to say thank you all. Thank you for the questions. Also, there will be a lot more. There's obviously a lot more to this subject, and there is a lot more on the BBC's Tomorrow's World website. So if you're watching out there, I'd encourage you to go to the website and have a look. There is time for one last question, though, and I wanted to ask you really, we've talked in broad terms about the past, present, and future of AI. What's the single biggest challenge, do you think, that AI will bring in society? And also, what do you think the single biggest benefit could be?
I think that the benefit is that the rate of being able to answer and ask questions, give advice, and make decisions will be astounding across education, science, nutrition, agriculture, right, in terms of farming, productivity, so forth. The biggest issue is that the human systems, right, governments and understanding, and the sort of the way in which we run the world is not going to run at the same pace. And that gap is a perpetual or evergreen gap, right? That the debates that we're having right now are not going to go away. And that even if we come to an agreement on the example that you used of what does the car decide, there'll be a next one and a next one. So I think the most important thing to do is to work on trying to understand the values that we as sort of the great societies reflect, and then codify them in some form in all the work that we do.
Well, Eric Schmidt, thank you very much. It's been
thank you all.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you from all of us here at the Science Museum and from BBC Tomorrow's World Live. Good night.